Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Hello, welcome back. This is History Comes Alive, and I am your host, Jeff Nichols. And we are about to embark on the second part of our three-part mini-series on the Spanish Armada. In this particular episode, I want to title A Tale of Three Marys. Because like the previous episodes of the Three Henrys of France, or when we focused on William of Orange in the Netherlands, or even the Henrys of England in the previous episode, having a person or a small group of people to focus on can really help to frame an event. It helps to remember the needed concept or concepts for later application. And the three key people to consider on the way to the Spanish Armada, oddly enough, in today's episode, are all named Mary. There's Mary Guise, there's Mary Queen of the Scots, or Mary Stuart, and then there's going to be Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, English-born, Henry's daughter. And these women play pivotal roles in our narrative as we move from Henry's England, Henry VII and Henry VIII, to Elizabeth's England. Understanding their roles will help to develop the larger storyline. So we ended our time together in the last episode right at the time of Henry's death, only briefly reinforcing his desire to unite England and Scotland. And the idea was to secure the island against Catholic, European, Spanish, French threats by basically sealing it off. They had a strong navy. It seemed wise to now isolate the island through consolidation and unification. You remember, Henry had already annexed Wales at this time. So we'll jump around a little bit before settling down to our storyline, as there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of people involved, some of which we'll definitely recognize from previous episodes. So the goal for today in this episode is twofold. The first one is to get us to the time of the Armada with some semblance of what happened to provoke it. And secondly, to really start to tie all of the loose ends together from the 5 previous episodes. It's very exciting. So we'll be going a little back and forth for a while to make sure that all of those pieces are in place. Just bear in mind that many of these topics are worthy of entire books of their own. Our view is just kind of cursory, but in the end, I think you'll find that the back and forth is going to be very helpful. So by the time Prince Edward was born, Henry had already been excommunicated by Rome and the Anglican Church had been established. And it was this act, you recall, that led Henry to declare himself, quote, the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, end quote. It was an act of treason to say otherwise. And you remember the enormous power grab that took place here. Any power not established under Henry VII was now firmly grasped by his son, Henry VIII. This was not a good time for Catholics in England. The Roman Church had property, including monasteries, confiscated by Henry. Clergy were executed. From a national security standpoint, England was seen to be a nation without a ruler by the Catholic powers of both Spain and France. Some of the vulnerability was negated by the ever-increasing naval ability. Some could be negated by an alliance with Scotland, the same Scotland that shared a land border with England. You see Henry's concern. You see England's concern. This is why Wales was annexed at this time as well, to seal off the island, to rely on the navy to protect all of England. Things got more interesting in 1542 when James V, the King of Scotland, died, James Stuart. His wife was Mary, not just a Frenchwoman, she was Mary Guise. Remember, they were a powerful family in French nobility that both rivaled and coveted the throne. Now, James's daughter was 6 days old, Mary Stuart, to be remembered as Mary Queen of the Scots later in life. She was the heir apparent. So the story opens with 2 Marys from Scotland. And the third in our story is Henry's kid, Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Philip and Isabella's daughter, who would in time be remembered as Bloody Mary. Remember, the union of Catherine and Henry VIII was a deathbed request from Henry VII. Geographical proximity was not the only connection here. These families were connected. James's father had been married to Henry's aunt, Margaret. So Mary Stuart of the House of Guise on her mother's side was a bona fide Tudor, a potential threat to the English line of succession, a potential Catholic threat to Anglican England with powerful continental resources. Henry had a plan for succession. Even though Edward was the youngest, he was the male heir that Henry had sought through all of those wives. Edward was first in line, and second was the eldest sister, Mary, and third was Elizabeth. She and Mary had only been reinstated into the mix when Edward was born. Now, Henry died in 1547, January 8th, 1547, without the line of succession fully ironed out. His goal had been twofold. First, Edward would be king, thus avoiding a civil war internally. But Edward would be married to his cousin, Mary of Scotland, to reduce the threat to England. Edward was 9 at the time. The future Queen Elizabeth was 13, and young Mary of Scotland was just 4 years old. Edward was being guided by his uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. And it was the Duke who really blew things up. Now again, Henry died without getting the marriage between Edward and Mary secured. And the real rub was that Edward was Protestant, or Anglican, and Mary was Catholic. Henry declared war, but then he died. And Seymour took up the mantle. The Navy played a major role. This period is known as the Rough Wooing. It is also, in hindsight, a good practice run for later for the English Navy. Now, Lord Seymour, Lord Protector, as he was titled, the Duke of Somerset, Edward's guy, took matters to the extreme. He led an English army with naval support into Scotland to fetch a wife for Edward. I'm not thinking this approach was very good for relations, and success may have been contested, but at any rate, Lord Seymour led the attack. And this was a major operation. The Navy was purported to be 80 vessels strong. That's quite a navy in those days, boasting 9,200 sailors and soldiers. And some of these were very powerful for their day. The Henry Grace Adu, for example, had 50 guns. The Battle of Pinkie Cleugh was not only an English victory, it was, perhaps, Henry's greatest achievement. It was post-mortem. This battle is recognized as the first modern battle on British soil. It had it all: firearms, infantry, artillery, cavalry, naval bombardment. The problem was that the object of Seymour's invasion was not there. The young Mary had been wisely whisked away to France for her own protection, whisked away to the French court under the protection and security of her very powerful French relatives, the Guises. She was also betrothed to the French Dauphin, the king-in-waiting, Francis, a king that we've met previously when we discussed the French wars of religion. He was Henry II's son. Almost more importantly, he was the son of Catherine de' Medici, and he would be king, briefly. Weak and used by the Guises against the Huguenots, he would reign about a year, 15 months, and subsequently upon his death, Catherine, his mother, would send Mary back to Scotland. English and Scottish unification was still about 50 years away at this point. When Mary did return to Scotland years later, Elizabeth would be queen, and Elizabeth would be ready. Remember our transparency model? We're laying one sheet upon another. Well, this was all going on while the continent was really heating up, to England's advantage. I mean, we're quickly approaching the times, if not already there, when Spain was entangled with the Ottomans, the Netherlands, and France. And France was engaged with the Spanish, and the English somewhat, as well as itself with all of those civil wars. And Scotland was experiencing the Reformation challenge, as like the Continentals were. The Reformation was driving much of this conflict. So nobody had time to fully engage the English. But Henry's goal of unification was not to be. Scotland, embroiled in their own internal struggles with Protestantism, was hostile to England. Scotland was hostile to Henry. So back in France, 10 years after being whisked away, Mary was finally married to Francis, and this formally combined the Scottish and the French thrones. When Francis dies 15 months later, Mary, the Queen of the Scots, became Queen Consort of France, and the Guises were that close to the throne. As a family, they were described this way by one historian. You remember we've met these guys before. They were described this way, quote, magnificent in presence, consummate in charm and energy, audacious, vindictive, and capable of abominable cruelty, end quote. They were often at odds with the rest of France and the French court. And remember, Mary was a Guise. Joseph Cummins related a story of their capacity and Mary's when he tells of a time during the short reign of Francis when the Protestants, the Huguenots, plotted to wipe them out. When the plot was discovered, they promptly rounded up 50 Protestant leaders and tortured them in the courtyard of the castle, causing Mary to drown out the screams of the tortured. Mary is reported to have sung hymns and recited the Psalms. Thus, when Francis died, we now understand why Catherine de' Medici got her daughter-in-law out of the country and back to Scotland. She didn't want any part of that challenge. If you think about it, Catherine de' Medici killed two birds with one stone. Her immediate threat and rival was gone, and her irritants to the west, across the Channel, England, would now have to contend with Mary. So, it's 1560, and Mary returns to Scotland. And here is where the English rejoin our storyline. Mary requested safe travel through English territory. You remember, this would not have been a welcome situation for England or Elizabeth, knowing that Mary's got some claim to the English throne. Mary was now 19 years old, and she was educated. And she understood power. Mary was said to be passionate and beautiful, very beautiful. We already know how heartless she can be. And she was returning to the island that had changed a lot in her absence. Elizabeth had been queen at this point for 2 years. Now, previously, this would have been a very unlikely scenario. Henry had died and left the throne to Edward, who in turn died at the age of 15. And the succession plan was supposed to go from Edward to Mary Tudor and then to Elizabeth. But on his deathbed, Edward changed all of that. He named Lady Jane Grey as his successor. And that went over like a ton of bricks. It took only 9 days for Mary, Bloody Mary, to overthrow her and have her executed. Now, Mary was a Catholic, and her reign was brutal for the Protestants, and there were many public executions. At one such execution, when 7 Protestants were killed at one time, a poet opined, "When these at Maidstone were put to death, we wished for our Elizabeth." Maybe so, but really, shut up. Consider the times. Was that a good idea to do to your champion? Put her in the crosshairs of a maniac? Now, Mary was married to Philip of Spain and wished to restore Catholicism to England. Public figures were not exempt from her terror. Prominent men like Thomas Cranmer, Hugh Latimer, and Nicholas Ridley were burned at the stake. Mary became jealous of Elizabeth, and she accused Elizabeth of plotting against her. Remember, these ladies are half-sisters. But the charge of treason would not stick, and Elizabeth's life would be spared. In time, their relationship was restored to the extent that Mary named Elizabeth her successor. So in 1558, that happened. Mary died, and Elizabeth was queen. It's an unlikely outcome all the way around. Elizabeth is queen, and Mary soon returns from the French court. Elizabeth arrived just in time to the English throne. Elizabeth arrived for a time such as this. The reigns of Edward and Lady Jane Grey and Mary would prove to be no match for Elizabeth's leadership and her cunning. Lacey J. Baldwin Smith captured the grandeur and the majesty of Elizabeth this way, quote, "Elizabeth was her father's daughter, athletic, red-haired, autocratic, inordinately vain, and of stately, majestic deportment. Time and again, her subjects saw the reflection of the iron-willed giant in the slender person of their monarch. Indeed, when Londoners first beheld their queen, they exclaimed, "Remember old King Henry VIII." End quote. The Spanish ambassador immediately sensed the similarity and reported to his masters that Elizabeth seems to be, quote, incomparably more feared than her sister, and gives her orders and has her way as absolutely as her father did, end quote. That's quite a compliment. Mary's killing people by the hundreds. Henry had absolute rule. And the Spanish ambassador says that Elizabeth surpasses them both. Now, Elizabeth was initially supported by Philip at Rome. He preferred her to the devout Catholic that was beholden to the Valois French monarchs, Mary, the Queen of the Scots. He wanted to marry Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England, but she would not convert to Catholicism. Imagine Philip's world at this point. He was contending with Catherine de' Medici in France, Mary in Scotland, who was a little hard to control, as we'll soon see, and Elizabeth. And you've got to understand, Philip had technically been the King of England when Mary was alive, because that had been his wife. Their union produced no heirs, however. Now, marrying Elizabeth made sense to Philip. I mean, after all, Henry had done this for Arthur with Catherine of Aragon a generation earlier, and he had done it with the Pope's blessing. These are strange times. I mean, everybody feared everybody, and everybody needed everybody. Diplomacy was more like espionage, and marriage was a tool to build alliances and to avoid war. You see how the suspense is beginning to build? Elizabeth had been family. She was a preferred personality to the Catholic alternatives, and she was quickly turning into an adversary. Elizabeth was supporting piracy, and she was using that money to support causes like the Dutch Rebellion. If she wasn't doing that yet, she would be very soon. In addition, Scotland was in the midst of their own Protestant Reformation. The Calvinists had made major inroads. France was losing influence. So Mary, upon Francis's death, was eyed to marry his brother Charles by her Guise uncles to keep them close to the throne. You remember how this worked. Catherine de' Medici saw 3 successive sons sit on the throne. But Catherine de' Medici blocked that marriage. And Philip had tried to get his son to marry Mary Stuart Guise to influence the French courts, but Catherine de' Medici had blocked that marriage as well. You remember, she's a very shrewd woman. Philip's aim was also to influence the French throne, and he was not too sure about the Guises, even though he supported the Holy League. And he was also not too sold on Catherine de' Medici, as you can see why. So yep, the world was changing, and it's sometimes hard to keep track of. Everybody needed everybody, and everybody feared everybody. So in the midst of all of this scheming and posturing before the modern nation state, Elizabeth was ushering in a new tone in England. And again, my thanks to historian Lacey Baldwin Smith, who said, quote, "Once acknowledged queen, Elizabeth turned to men of moderation regardless of their faith. As the prop and stay of her reign, her council was reduced from 44 men to fewer than 20 and purged of its episcopal members, for Elizabeth preferred laymen as her associates in government. In part, the secular spirit of her administration was a matter of taste. In part, it was the result of circumstances. As the child of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth could be nothing except Protestant. But her faith was not the militant and burning Protestantism of the Marian exiles returning from Geneva. Instead, it was that strange spiritual mixture her father had brutally enforced on his kingdom. A muddled, headless Catholicism that insisted on outward conformity but allowed sufficient doctrinal breadth so that both Protestant and Catholic could find it acceptable. The new queen desired to open no windows into men's souls and to light no fires to consume their bodies. For Elizabeth, the essence of religion remained mystical and personal. And there was, she said, only one Christ Jesus and one faith. The rest is a dispute about trifles. End quote. So Elizabeth's position was national unity over division. You remember we talked about that when we were looking at France in the midst of those 8 civil wars. national unity over division, inner freedom, public conformity. The modern nation state of the West as we know it today. Now the stage is set. Elizabeth was popular. She had ingratiated herself to the people. I think they just wanted some neighborhood peace, in all honesty. I mean, people get tired of strife and struggle. They get tired of war. They get tired of hating their neighbors. They get tired of suspecting their government. Joseph Cummings put it this way, quote, Elizabeth had bright red hair, very pale skin, a longish face, eyes that were an unusually dark hue for someone of her coloring. She was short-sighted and had an endearing habit of leaning towards people when she spoke to them, which seemed to ask them to confide in her, end quote. Men loved Elizabeth and she loved them. But since the days of Thomas Seymour in her youth, she repelled romantic overtures from everybody. She was, after all, going to be remembered as the Virgin Queen. So the national backstory here in 1560, as Mary comes back into Scotland, is the Treaty of Edinburgh. Scotland was becoming increasingly Protestant. Francis, the King of France, was gone, and Catherine de' Medici was consolidating her power base in France to preserve the Valois line. And Mary Guise, you remember her, the mother of Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of the Scots, the one married to Francis Valois. Well, Mary Guise had been up in Scotland running the country in Mary Stuart's absence. She died. Mary Guise had been ruling Scotland since her husband James V had died, and Mary Stuart had been whisked off to France almost 15 years earlier. It is at this time the Treaty of Edinburgh was signed. France gave up her claim to the Scottish throne. The dangerous, from an English perspective, Scottish-Franco alliance had been severed. This set in motion the Anglo-Scottish tension that would ultimately lead to union. And the Treaty of Edinburgh also recognized the Treaty of Chateau-Cambrésis. You remember we've talked about this treaty before, between England and France. France would gain Calais, but England would rid the French threat in Scotland. So under this treaty, Mary could no longer use the titles of English and Irish heraldry. And the problem was that Mary had never ratified or agreed to this. She didn't recognize it. So the French made a decision in their national best interest, and they kind of cut Mary out of the process as they're kind of shipping her out of the country. Mary believed that she had legitimate claims to the English throne, and there were a lot of Catholics in England. And Elizabeth, for her part, had not helped the relationship. I mean, she had been supporting the Scottish reformers. Those were those who were to contend with Mary in Scotland. When Mary heard of this, her response was, quote, I never rebelled against your throne, end quote. And also added, be not of mind, she, Elizabeth, is neither in religion nor in other things inclined to hear offers. And what she was getting at was that she would actually be more popular in England than Elizabeth was. Her take was that she could be popular and she could remove Elizabeth. That's not such a veiled threat, is it? It's that kind of arrogance that would eventually do Mary in. The question I have at this point when you're looking at this scenario is, can't we all just get along? To get to Scotland, Mary had requested a safe passage guarantee from Elizabeth. While Elizabeth weighed her options, Mary grew impatient and traveled without that guarantee, claiming that if she ran into trouble, Elizabeth would surely grab her. Very provocative, and not very bright if you ask me. The reception that Mary received in Scotland was celebratory, but that was short-lived. Men like reformer John Knox had a powerful influence, and he threatened Mary with, quote, with the plagues of God for her worship of Catholic idols, end quote. And the weather climate wasn't so good either. Now, Elizabeth continued to push for a resolution about the English throne as well, but Mary wouldn't budge. She was the rightful successor. And in 1563, after a long battle with smallpox, Elizabeth extended yet another olive branch to Mary. She suggested that Mary marry Robert Dudley, one of her favorite people, and suspected greatest love, to secure the position as heir. Now, when we say that he was her greatest love, there was nothing physical between them, but he was probably her favorite person. At any rate, it was kind of a shock and a surprise that Elizabeth would suggest that, but Mary was insulted, and so she refused. Again, another bad decision on the part of Mary. She's already provoked Elizabeth. She's basically homeless in France. She's got challenges to her throne in Scotland. And it's at this time that her impetuous nature really appears to have kicked in. You begin to see why maybe Catherine de' Medici wanted her out of France. I mean, think about it, though. Mary's kind of a tragic figure. Let's consider her life so far. First of all, she's only like 19 years old. So she was born in Scotland. That wasn't her fault. She was raised in France, though, after being whisked away. That's not her fault. She's been basically kicked out of France, which wasn't her fault. And Scotland had turned largely Protestant in her absence. Not really her fault. However, the nitpicky relations with her cousin Elizabeth were kind of her fault. Demanding the succession to the English throne, that's all her fault. Traveling to Scotland through English territory while bad-mouthing Elizabeth, that's her fault. Suggesting that she'd be more popular than Elizabeth, that's her fault. Remember, Elizabeth was popular and got along well. But she was as shrewd as her father had been. And I wouldn't cross her. And in the end, you know what? Everyone's going to find that out. It got worse. Not only did Mary refuse to marry Robert Dudley, she picked her own husband. It was a bad pick. She married her heartthrob, Lord Darnley. He was an ambitious man and another claimant to the English throne. His untitled name was Henry Stuart. Yep, that's right, Stuart. He was Mary's first cousin, and he was a monster. Henry Stuart was a power-hungry man. Mary couldn't give him enough power. And at one point, he physically attacked her when she was pregnant, and his goal at that point was to cause the miscarriage. And after that, Henry and a group of men plotted against David Rizzio, Mary's secretary and friend. And when they found him in Mary's inner chamber, even she could not save him. They dragged him out and stabbed him at least 50 times. Now, the pretense was adultery, but that wasn't proven. So soon after, Mary gave birth to James VI. It was 1566, and he would one day be a very important king. Now, as for Darnley, he met an untimely fate. There seems to have been an explosion in his home, and although his body was found 50 feet away from the blast, apparently he had been in the blast, he died from suffocation or strangulation and not the explosion itself. And although Mary and her soon-to-be husband, James Hepburn, were among those that were blamed, I mean, there's no discretion here whatsoever, right? He was her third husband. They were going to be married a few months later. It was never established what she knew or how much she knew about Henry's death. If nothing else, Mary's had quite a life to this point. I mean, quite a life. Well, the suspicious death and the quick marriage was a little too much for the Scots. So in June of 1567, an army of 3,000 Protestant leaders rose up against Mary and James. Mary was captured. James did manage to escape to Norway, but he ultimately died in prison, insane. Now, the Scottish throne was abdicated to Mary's 10-month-old son, James. It's funny how unstable a world all these folks are born into, right? Not just Mary Stuart, but Bloody Mary, and Edward, and Elizabeth. For context, on the continent at this time, you remember from previous episodes, this is when William of Orange was just beginning to heat up the Dutch rebellion against Philip. This was also when the French were just a few years away from the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, where many of the Huguenots were butchered. So a final nail to that chapter came soon after Mary was imprisoned at Lockhaven Castle. She miscarried twin boys. Their father had been James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. Mary escaped Lockhaven the following year and raised an army. I mean, if I was her, I think at this point, I would have found somewhere else to go. I would have hightailed it anywhere else. But Mary raised an army, and she was defeated by the same lords that had imprisoned her the first time. She fled to England, begging for Elizabeth's help. I mean, this puts everybody in a very awkward place. I wonder if Mary regretted her previous antics with Elizabeth. I wonder what Elizabeth was really thinking about. I mean, I don't think Mary regretted a whole lot. Elizabeth may have been inclined to help, except she had been aiding the Scottish Protestants against the throne, Mary's family throne. That would be pretty bad PR. Also, Elizabeth needed to make sure that she could count on the Scots in the event of French aggression. I mean, you remember, all of these guys back then, they weren't really very forgiving. So Elizabeth was kind of forced to, I'll do the air quotes, keep Mary. I mean, keep is a loose term. Nobody wanted Mary. I mean, it's odd for her lineage, but not the times that they lived in or the stakes that were at hand for all of these various nations. This girl was a loose cannon. The irony of Elizabeth getting stuck with Mary does not escape my imagination. I mean, between Philip and Catherine, the whole of Scotland, she would have been the last one that you would figure would be put in this position. Elizabeth was so disciplined and buttoned down, and Mary was anything but. Now, Elizabeth would deny Mary a personal audience indefinitely. Instead, she'd be imprisoned. She'd take care of her needs, but Mary was not free to move about. And first it was Bolton Castle and then Sheffield. Elizabeth had sympathy for Mary, but her advisors were calling for a trial and an execution, primarily around her dead husband's tragic end. But Elizabeth did not want that to happen, and so no matter how hard they tried, it didn't. Now, the imprisonment of Mary, Queen of the Scots, Mary Stuart, lasted 19 years. 19 years. Mary grew old. Well, I mean, she ended up being 42, in an English castle, locked away. Even in this predicament, Mary did not help her own cause. While pledging an undying support for Elizabeth, she was, at the same time, floating the idea of restoring Catholicism to England if Philip, the King of Spain, would simply help free her. I'll bet Philip was torn at this point. You remember, he had originally preferred Elizabeth, and they had been related, and he had desired the throne himself. But Elizabeth had turned on him, and the tension with Elizabeth had continued to grow. What was Philip to do? But Mary was not too smart. Again, Elizabeth was offering mercy. She was keeping her safe. She was very much in charge of England. Protestantism was winning. I mean, Mary did not have a lot of options. Keeping Mary was very taxing on everybody, including Elizabeth. I mean, frankly, it may have been easier just to execute her. There were many attempts over the years to rescue her and to kill Elizabeth. In 1569, there was the Revolt of the Northern Earls, which was an attempt by the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland. There were international plots as well. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot featured an Italian banker, the Duke of Norfolk, and Philip II of Spain, among others. And again, the coup was foiled and the participants executed, except for Philip. I guess the toleration phase was over for Philip. I mean, this was 17 years before the Armada, and he's trying to assassinate Elizabeth. Boy, was there a lot more to play out in this story. A lot more history to be written. And Mary would be there for all but 2 years of it. I mean, on a kind of laughable note, these executions from the Ridolfi plot led the Pope to excommunicate Elizabeth. I say it's almost laughable because, I mean, I think she's already gone, right? Like, you excommunicated her dad. She's actually overseeing in the Pope's mind, a Protestant nation. They're Anglican in England. I think she's already gone. She's probably excommunicated herself at this point. In 1585, Mary was transferred to a new castle. I mean, she had really had her way in the previous castle. The jailer there had fallen in love with her, as so many men were apt to do. He didn't let her escape, but she got away with a lot, and the optics weren't so good. But her new jailer, Sir Amias Paulet, was a strong Protestant and not swayed by Mary's beauty. It was not just that Anthony wrote to Mary of his plans, she had responded. One historian said it this way: whilst locked away, Mary advised the plotters, both in terms of strategy and how to ensure she'd win the English throne. And naturally, as the rightful ruler of England, Mary would be the one to sign off on the plot starting, which she did in July of 1586. Unfortunately for Mary, the plot had been infiltrated, and Elizabeth's own spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had been using the letters to entrap Mary and to get her to call for Elizabeth's murder, which, by signing off for the plot to go ahead, she had done. Everybody within the Babington plot, including Mary, was duly arrested. And the article goes on, in September of 1586, the first of the conspirators were executed, including ringleaders John Ballard and Anthony Babington. Onlookers said that by the time he arrived at the execution site, John Ballard's limbs were barely in their sockets as a result of the torture he'd undergone. One at a time, the men were hung, drawn, and quartered, forced to watch their fellows' dismemberment before their own death. The executions were so brutal that public outcry meant the other conspirators were just, quote, hung until they were quite dead, end quote, before being dismembered. Another account says it this way. You can never really be too sure sometimes. Sometimes these events from back then, they vary a little bit by whoever is writing the article and what they found, but they generally paint a very similar picture. And so another article said this: it was customary for a traitor's death to come by hanging, and for the blood rituals to be enacted on his corpse. This day, however, was different. One after another, the men were left to swing briefly by the neck, until they were half dead, an onlooker wrote, and then cut down from the gallows, still alive and conscious, and made to watch as the executioner hacked off their genitals and dug out their guts, and then eventually their hearts with his knife. As their insides were cast into a burning brazier, each man's body was then dismembered and the severed head set above the gallows. As the historian William Camden, a likely eyewitness, noted, the day's events were not without some note of cruelty. The first man to die was Ballard, arguably the plot's ringleader. The second, its linchpin, was Babington. He alone of the men standing beside the scaffold, awaiting their fate, watched Ballard's agony unflinchingly, coolly, not even deigning to remove his hat. The others turned away, fell to their knees, and bared their heads in prayer. But when it was his turn to suffer, and he was pulled down breathing from the gallows to face the executioner's knife, he cried again and again, Pars mihi Domini Isu, spare me, Lord Jesus. The one man who could have spared him, that is, persuaded Elizabeth to mitigate his sentence, or perhaps even negotiated his pardon, so great was his influence with Elizabeth, was not present. Babington had pleaded for his intercession on his behalf only the day before, offering the vast sum of £1,000 to do so. And that man was the Queen's favorite, Sir Walter Raleigh. It was now 1586, and this was such a blatant crime that Mary was put on trial and found guilty. And again, one of the articles that I read on this says, in her mind, she had been anointed by God to reign. That was something holy and untouchable. There was no law in the land that could hold jurisdiction over her. The only judgment she was accountable to was God's. However, it quickly became apparent that it wasn't God's holy anointed Mary going on trial for treason, but as the royal warrant for the trial put it, Mary, a mere woman, who was pretending title to this crown of this realm of England. Now, Mary's trial hearing started on the 14th of October, 1586. Though it operated as less of a trial and more of a really long argument between Mary and those convicting her. I mean, to say Mary would have made an excellent lawyer would be an understatement. She rallied hard with a stream of well-thought-out and articulated arguments, always ready with something to fight the prosecution's threats and refusals to acknowledge her words. Mary's arguments included that she wasn't an English subject and therefore couldn't be held as an English traitor. She'd been denied legal counsel or the right to view evidence being brought against her. And did she mention she was a queen, anointed by God? It would literally be a sin to kill her. After Mary's hearing was finished, the trial was adjourned to the Star Chamber, leaving Mary at Fotheringay Castle. Then on the 25th of October, the trial was completed, without anyone telling Mary. The trial's commissioners found Mary guilty of treason, and together with Parliament, they urged Elizabeth to execute Mary as quickly as humanly possible. But Elizabeth did not want to execute Mary. Though there had been a lot of bad blood between the pair of queens, there had also been a kind of respect. They were so similar in so many ways. Cousins thrust into positions of power, considered above their gender. No matter how begrudging, there was a bond there. After Mary's second husband, Lord Darnley, died in an incredibly suspicious explosion, Elizabeth wrote to Mary, urging her to distance herself from the scandalous tragedy as, Quote, I treat you as my daughter and assure you that if I had one, I could wish for her nothing better than I desire for you. But even more than the bond Elizabeth shared with Mary, she didn't want to execute her because it set a deadly precedent to lawfully kill a sovereign. Elizabeth had hoped that she'd be able to pardon her cousin, that Mary would beg for forgiveness, but none of that happened. And that's the end of that article, but I would just add to that, none of that happened because Mary was stubborn. Elizabeth signed the death warrant reluctantly. I mean, she did pity Mary, but also had concerns as to how Philip was going to react, as well as Scotland. I mean, after all, King James was Mary's son. Elizabeth would have loved to find another way. I mean, she tried to find another way. It's been reported that she contacted the jailer and asked him to kill Mary and make it look like natural causes. But he refused. You remember, this guy was a hardline Protestant. Although she had received the death warrant in October of 1586, it was not signed until February 1st, 1587. The royal advisors knew they had to act fast, and it was in the hesitant Elizabeth's best interest that they do so. So on February 7th, 1587, Elizabeth's advisors, acting without her knowledge, delivered the fateful news. Mary would be executed the following day. And again, quoting from my previous article, we read that her last hours were spent both in prayer and sorting out her affairs. Sleeping would be near impossible, thanks to the incessant, loud hammering as the execution scaffold was hastily being erected. Imagine that last night. Imagine sitting there trying to get your affairs in order and hearing them building your scaffolding. So the morning of February 8th was a very cold day. The record indicates that Mary was very brave. Mary was sober-minded, disciplined, and accepting. I can't help but run through in my mind all the international wranglings of these times. Think about the roles and the situations in the Dutch Netherlands, in France, in Spain, in Scotland. Mary had been a key consideration in all of these areas except for the Netherlands. And that was a key area for England. Now imagine if all of these Catholic nations had not had so many situations over these last several decades internally. Maybe Mary would have been freed. Maybe the English crown would have been snatched from Protestantism and Anglicanism. Maybe Elizabeth would not have survived. But the reality is, all these nations, their leaders and populations were embroiled in constant conflict, seemingly no time to ever regroup or really go after what they'd have preferred. Mary had presented a very real threat to England, and that was about to be quelled. Now, if you're anything like me, you love a good story of bravery, within reason, right? There can be strong feelings towards a person, even a flawed person, when you consider how they died or where they came from. What might have provoked their behavior? How things could have been different? Maybe the criminal would have been the good guy if just a few things had gone differently, if they'd have survived and been able to tell their story. It should go without saying when you make a comment like that the bravery of a serial killer or a rapist is more than a little overshadowed by the heinousness of their crimes, right? But what about political or social crimes? People on the opposite side of popular culture. Their successes can be genuine. They can be capable of heroism, of bravery. What if the American Revolution had failed? How would our national heroes have been remembered? What about the glamorization of criminals? The kind from long ago, those whose lives capture the imagination. Nostalgic figures of the old American West. Men like Billy the Kid. I love Billy the Kid. I find him almost irresistible when I hear him being mentioned. Bear with me here for a second. Billy the Kid was probably born Henry McCarty. Later, he donned the name William H. Bonney. Billy the Kid had a very tough childhood. He was, to me, a product of his environment and the times. Very tragic. He wasn't a bank robber or he wasn't robbing trains like so many of the other guys from his times. He was a cattle rustler and a killer for sure. But he wasn't always the cold-blooded killer that he ended up being. Some of his exploits are downright brave and cunning. Most of the men that he killed were not good guys themselves. I mean, does that justify his behavior? Of course not. But there are parts of his story that can have you rooting for him. And until the end of his life, a lot of people did. So whether I read Sheriff Pat Garrett's account, I mean, he's the lawman who gunned Billy down, or listen to someone talk about him, or listen to a song in his memory, there's a nostalgia about Billy the Kid. I'm not the only one either that feels that way. I mean, there's been over 50 movies about Billy the Kid's life. A-list movie actors like Emilio Estevez and Val Kilmer, Paul Newman, Roy Rogers have all been featured as Billy the Kid. And Chris Ledoux, one of my favorite artists, sang a song called Billy the Kid. It was actually written by Charlie Daniels. And it's a narrative that always gets me pumped up. And it goes like this. I want to read the lyrics. Again, I thought I would sing them. I'm going to chicken out of that. So my one and only public singing isn't going to happen today. But it says this. These are the lyrics. In the southern part of Texas, east and west of El Paso, where the mighty Franklin Mountains guard the trail to Mexico, there's a new-made widow crying and a hearse a-rolling slow, and I guess that devil's passed this way again. There's a leathered sorrel stallion running through the Joshua trees, a young man in the saddle with his coattails in the breeze, got a 6-gun on his right hip and a rifle at his knee, and he's dealing in a game that he can't win. Poor Billy Bonney, you're only 21. Pat Garrett's got your name on every bullet in his gun. Each notch you carved on your 6 guns got a bloody tale to tell. Well, you're a mile ahead of Garrett and a step outside of hell. Them fancy clothes you're wearing and the women in your bed can't take away the faces of the men that you left dead. As you ride across the Badlands with a price upon your head, now that wheel of fortune starts to turn. Your reputation's grown till it's the biggest in the land, and there ain't a lot of people left who want to call your hand. And I guess you'll go down shooting just like all branded men, and when you shake hands with the devil, you get burned. Poor Billy Bonney, you're only 21. Pat Garrett's got your name on every bullet in his gun. Each notch you carved on your 6 guns got a bloody tale to tell. Well, you're a mile ahead of Garrett and a step outside of hell. Billy Bonney had courage. A courage that most men could only dream about. His was a life of daring. He had great exploits. I think Mary's a lot like Billy the Kid. Tragic, circumstantial. She captures my imagination. I can't help but to think about her, her life, her legacy, and in the end, her time was up. Quicker than it seemed like it would be, just like Billy the Kid. I mean, make no mistake, this side of history paints her as a criminal and a public nuisance, mostly because she lost. Of course, her impetuous nature did her no favors, nor did Billy's. Mary was a villain in the classic sense. She was a would-be usurper of authority. People died because of Mary. She was stubborn. She pushed the envelope. And if Mary's a picture of Billy the Kid, then Elizabeth was Pat Garrett. And in the end, the only thing left to do was put her down. So it was on that cold morning, Mary was led to a low platform within the castle that housed her. She had 6 servants attending her, and she wanted them to bear witness near and far of her execution. And again, if I return to my original article that I was reading, tells us this. Traditionally, women of Mary's status were allowed their ladies around them on the scaffold. They not only gave one last herald of the commend status, but perhaps more importantly, the women provided comfort before the axe fell and then shielded the broken body, offering dignity in death by not subjecting the women to being stripped by men for burial. To be rejected this right at the last minute was a huge blow. And though she maintained a calm exterior, Mary begged to be allowed her ladies. She was rejected, but refused to give up, pleading for this, her final right. Eventually, the counselors gave in on condition that Mary's ladies did not loudly weep or wail or generally erupt into female hysteria. And so Mary climbed the stairs of the scaffold with her ladies in tow. As Mary waited for the death sentence to be read out, a man burst forth from the crowd. Dr. Fletcher, the Protestant dean of Peterborough, proclaimed that it wasn't too late for Mary to save her soul and convert from Catholicism to the Protestant faith. Mary ignored his loud protestations and prayers until eventually breaking and saying, "Mr. Dean, Trouble not yourself any more, for I am settled and resolved in this my religion, and am purposed therein to die. Mary came to the platform wearing a black robe and a white veil. She carried her crucifix and refused the Protestant chaplain assigned to her, declaring her fidelity to the Roman Church. It must have been a solemn scene. I mean, was it cold at the platform? They say that the day was bitterly cold. Was it quiet? Did it echo in the hallway? Was it damp? Were there pleasantries that had been exchanged? What was the walk like? I wonder how long a walk it was to the platform. And then as I was thinking about this, once again, I was thinking about what happens in a beheading. Is it messy and painful? I mean, it's not clean and neat, right? Usually, from what I've understood, it takes more than one whack. I mean, there's a lot of contingencies here. I mean, what if the executioner misses the exact mark? What if the condemned person flinches? I think I'd be a flincher. I think when I finally heard the action coming, their hands starting to move, I think I'd flinch. Are you conscious when this happens? So there's general accounts to think about. So here's one article that I did read on an execution. And again, you can find guys contradicting themselves, and you can find from very different angles and very different opinions. But here's one, and I'm quoting an article here, quote, "A particularly detailed report comes from Dr. Burrow, who, under perfect circumstances, experimented with the head of the murderer, Langwell, guillotined at 5:30 a.m. on the 28th of June, 1905. And this comes from a book entitled A History of the Guillotine by Alistair Kershaw. And his source was the Archive d'Anthropologie Criminelle, 1905. And this is what Dr. Burrow recorded. Here, then, is what I was able to note immediately after the decapitation. The eyelids and lips of the guillotined man worked in irregularly rhythmic contractions for about 5 or 6 seconds. I waited for several seconds. The spasmodic movements ceased. The face relaxed. The lids half closed on the eyeballs, leaving only the white of the conjunctiva visible, exactly as in the dying whom we have occasion to see every day in the exercises of our profession, or as in those just dead. It was then that I called in a strong, sharp voice, 'Langwell!' I saw the eyelids slowly lift up, without any spasmodic contractions. Next, Langwell's eyes very definitely fixed themselves on mine, and the pupils focused themselves. After several seconds, the eyelids closed again, slowly and evenly, and the head took on the same appearance as it had before I called out. It was at that point that I called out again, and once more, without any spasm, slowly, the eyelids lifted, and undeniably living eyes fixed themselves on mine with perhaps even more penetration than the first time. Then there was a further closing of the eyelids, but now less complete. I attempted the effect of a third call. There was no further movement in the eyes, and the eyes took on the glazed look which they have in the dead. I have just recounted to you with rigorous exactness what I was able to observe. The whole thing had lasted 25 to 30 seconds. End quote. So that gives us one look at one man's examination of a head that's been severed. I don't know. I know that the reports vary. Some guys disagree. Some people say that when the head is severed, you fall into a coma. Others say that you're completely oblivious. Some people say you go into shock. But that was just one account. But I wanted to start to wrap our heads around the graphic nature of what goes on. I mean, it really is easy to sanitize it by saying the word guillotine, or just, in a passing glance, talk about beheading somebody. But these things are really quite gruesome. And so back to the scene, and more specifically, back to Mary. And I want you to bear with me because there is a little narration. There's a little quotation. There's some exact details here that vary a little bit. And again, it's not uncommon sometimes in these historical events, but I want to take a look at this and we begin to at least get the flavor of what Mary was going through. So upon ascending the platform, Mary forgave the executioner that awaited her. She removed her black robe and revealed a red petticoat, the color symbolizing the blood of her martyrdom, and possibly, as one historian at least said, the sexuality that Elizabeth had denied herself all of her life. One article that I read on this summarizes it this way. In speaking of the red petticoat, this color wasn't a random choice, but the red of Catholic martyrdom. Mary was making a clear statement. She was anointed by God. To kill her was a sin, and in death she would become a holy martyr. The wordless statement from Mary's blood-red petticoat rang throughout the great hall, even as Mary was blindfolded, laid her head on the block, and stretched her arms wide to signal the executioner's axe. Mary blindfolded herself and laid her head across the chopping block. And she exclaimed, according to one historian, "In manus tuas, Domine," meaning "into thy hands, O Lord." She managed to say "Sweet Jesus" at the failure of the first stroke, which missed the neck and hit the skull. And with the second, her neck was severed. And again, I'm not trying to be overly graphic here. Reports vary a little bit. There are a lot of similarities, but I wanted to read a couple of accounts of this. So again, from the same article that I've been reading from fyeahhistory.com. They talked about it this way. The accounts vary on if Mary cried out from the pain or remained silent. However, as this was a chop wound, a mix of sharp force and blunt force trauma, it's most likely that Mary felt excruciating pain for a few seconds before losing consciousness. The axe's second blow hit her neck, severing it almost entirely, with 1/3 chop needed to separate Mary's head from her body. The executioner then picked Mary's head up by the hair, held it forth to the crowd, and proclaimed, "God save the Queen." At which point he lost grip on the head as Mary's wig fell off, revealing her graying hair. Something people were shocked about, despite the fact that she was 44 and they'd just witnessed her bloody execution. And with that macabre farce, the story of Mary, the Queen of Scots, came to an end. End quote. And there's just one more account I'd like to read for you. This one seems to have struck more of a chord with me, It's much shorter. This comes from ain'tnowaytogo.com, beheading.hotmail. Quote, when Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringay Castle in 1587, a clumsy headsman gave her 3 strokes without quite managing to sever her head. The headsman then had to saw through the skin and gristle with his sheath knife before the job could be regarded as complete. The profound, protracted groan Mary gave when the axe first hit left the horrified witnesses in no doubt that her pain was excruciating. Any way you look at these accounts, none of them are pleasant. All of them seem to indicate that it wasn't a smooth beheading, if there is such a thing. Details can vary, but the drama and the weight of the scene is captured. And whatever you think of Mary, the last night and morning were recorded as dignified, in my mind, to say the least. She comes off as stoic, maybe stubborn, icy, resolved, confident, faithful to her God. Whatever the adjectives you want to use, I see bravery in this. Like Billy the Kid, her wheel of fortune had started to turn. She had shook hands with the devil and got burned. She had lived a wild life. People had died around her, and she was now caught and would now pay. She seemed accepting of the situation. Maybe she was just tired. I think I would be. 19 years imprisoned. On a personal note, remember Elizabeth would have been intimately acquainted with the emotion of the action. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been beheaded. And remember, this action had taken place very swiftly, before Elizabeth could deny it again. It had to be done. But when Elizabeth found out, she was furious. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Sometimes difficult things must be done. Sometimes in the course of human events, people are destroyed for the quote-unquote greater good. Sometimes that's just hyperbole, but sometimes the drastic actions taken are necessary. In either case, these are not easy on the people that are responsible for carrying out the deeds that protect the vulnerable or the weak or those who must be served. It can be easier to nitpick later than it is to act or to react in the heat of the moment. Personally, I'm thankful that I haven't had too many of those types of responsibilities in my life. It can sometimes be easy to spot those that have been most protected, though. They're those who protest the most loudly about things they don't understand, that they know nothing about. They protest things and actions that have been taken on their behalf. Sometimes those very actions, whether they're right or wrong, are found in the eye of the beholder, more easily judged or dismissed as time passes. It's good to consider these storylines this way, to really think about these events. It can bring clarity to our own lives and some of the difficult decisions that we might have to make. Or it can help us to extend a little bit of grace, a little bit of latitude, and a whole lot of empathy for others when they're put into the meat grinder of life themselves. All the world's a stage, Shakespeare once wrote, and we are merely players. Elizabeth was right. The execution of Mary Stuart, which I feel had to be done for the good of England, was a part of the motivation of Philip's Armada 2 years later. But Elizabeth would be up to the challenge. Now, as a side note, it strikes me, this is just a few decades later when Elizabeth would name James VI of Scotland as her heir, James Stuart, Mary's son. So in a way, Mary did ascend to the English throne posthumously, vicariously through her son. James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. He had been raised to rule from the age of 1 year old in 1566 when his mother abdicated the throne and fled. He had been raised by both Catholic and Protestant advisors. By 1583, he was coming into his own and chose Anglican England over Catholic Europe. He was, after all, Henry VII's great-grandson. James would represent a new union, the United Kingdom of England and Scotland. James would ignite English colonialism. The first English settlement of Jamestown was named in his honor. His insistence on the divine right of kings put him at odds with Parliament. Now, early on, James was good for England, and he enjoyed success. In 1604, he ended the war with Spain. And again in 1604 at the Hampton Court Conference, he rejected most Puritan demands for the reform of the Church of England. But he did authorize a new translation of the Bible, the King James Version. And in 1605, he survived the Gunpowder Plot, which was a plot by English Catholics, provoked by his treatment of them, he was harsh, to blow up Parliament and kill the king. They say loose lips sink ships, and so they do. This plot was foiled because of Lord Monteagle. He was a member of Parliament. His brother-in-law was one of the conspirators. He warned Lord Monteagle not to go to Parliament on November 5th, 1605. Monteagle alerted the authorities, and the leader of the plot had been Robert Catesby. He had recruited a man named Guy Fawkes. And when the plot was revealed, Fawkes was found in a cellar under Westminster with 20 barrels of gunpowder. Fawkes was arrested and tortured, and he promptly revealed his co-conspirators. Though James survived this assassination attempt and did appear to make wise decisions early in his reign, these times did not last. But that's a story for another day, perhaps. And that rounds out our look at the story of the Three Marys, as we make our way to the battle for England, when the Spanish Armada came knocking, sailing. It's funny, as much as the Marys seem to dominate the storyline, Elizabeth's the real star here. And I hope that our time together has made one more aspect of history come alive. Next week, we'll finish off our opening series with the grand finale, an overview of the Spanish Armada and its aftermath, the culmination of Henry's vision, Elizabeth's steely resolve, and the men who delivered England.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.